Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly, and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into the world of Marco Polo, following the slow trails of merchants, caravans, sea winds, and stories that traveled farther than the people who first carried them. Together, we'll step into medieval Venice, into the vast Mongol Empire, and into the uncertain space where history and legend begin to blur like lantern light on dark water. But before you settle in, if you truly enjoy these calm journeys through history, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe, only if it feels right for you. And when you're ready, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always a quiet joy to see how many places and moments gather here together. Now dim the lights. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's slowly step into the past, gently, quietly, together. You begin in Venice. Not Italy, not yet. Italy does not exist in the way you would understand it now. Instead, you find yourself in a city-state, floating upon pale green water, a republic built not upon farmland or cavalry, but upon trade, patience, and salt. The air is cool tonight. A faint mist hangs over the lagoon, softening the lantern glow that spills across narrow canals. Wooden docks creak gently beneath the shifting tide. Somewhere nearby, ropes knock lazily against a mast with a hollow tapping sound that repeats again and again like a sleepy clock. Venice in the 13th century feels less like a city and more like a living harbor. Everything moves. Boats glide where carts would travel elsewhere in Europe. Merchants shout from bridges. Fishermen unload silver-skinned catches before sunrise. The smell of seawater mixes with wet timber, lamp smoke, tar, and distant spices that arrived weeks earlier from ports no ordinary Venetian will ever see. You quickly realize something unusual about this place. Most medieval cities stare inward, protected by thick walls and suspicious of outsiders. Venice does the opposite. Venice faces outward, toward the sea, toward Egypt, Constantinople, Persia, and lands so distant they almost feel imaginary. And this outward gaze makes the city wealthy beyond reason. The Venetians have discovered something powerful, long before many kingdoms fully understand it. Trade can build an empire just as surely as war can, sometimes more effectively. Armies are expensive. Merchants, meanwhile, occasionally complain while becoming richer every year. So Venice fills itself with merchants instead of knights. The Rialto market hums from morning until evening. Greek sailors bargain beside Armenian traders. Jewish money changers count coins beneath striped awnings. Arab merchants unload pepper, cinnamon, silk, and dyes so vivid they almost seem unreal against the grey stone streets. You hear languages from every corner of the Mediterranean: French, Greek, Arabic, Latin, Venetian dialects, spoken so quickly they seem to splash like water themselves. For a child growing up here, the wider world never feels entirely distant. It feels close enough to smell. A crate of cloves arrives from India. A bolt of silk from China passes through careful hands beneath a warehouse lantern. Stories drift in with every tide. Storms near Cyprus. Pirates off the North African coast. Cities farther east where markets stretch for miles, and emperors dine from golden bowls. Most people hearing such tales cannot verify them. But in Venice, stories are not simply entertainment. They are information. Useful information. The sort that tells merchants where fortunes might be made and where ships might disappear forever beneath dark water. And somewhere inside this restless city, sometime around the middle of the 13th century, a boy named Marco Polo is born into that atmosphere of trade, rumor, distance, and waiting. His family is respectable, though not especially grand. Merchants, not nobles. Practical people. Men who think carefully about cargo weights and exchange rates. Men who understand that survival often depends less upon bravery than upon timing. Marco's father, Niccolo Polo, spends much of his life away from home. This is common in Venice. So common, in fact, that the city quietly learns to live with absence. Ships leave for years at a time. Some return loaded with silk and silver. Others never return at all. Venice becomes a place filled with wives waiting at windows, children staring toward the harbor, and merchants pretending not to calculate risk, while absolutely calculating risk every moment of the day. A dockworker near the Rialto pauses tonight beside several heavy sacks of cinnamon newly unloaded from a ship arriving from Alexandria. His hands are rough from wet rope and winter air. He cannot read. He will never see Persia or Cathay or the distant eastern ports from which these goods ultimately came. And yet his entire life is shaped by places he will never visit. That is the strange magic of Venice. The world arrives here in fragments, in spice dust, in silk threads, in stories. As evening settles across the lagoon, church bells begin to ring softly through the damp air. Gondolas drift beneath stone bridges. Candlelight flickers behind narrow windows. Somewhere in the darkness, a merchant quietly studies maps beside a bowl of cooling soup, wondering whether another route farther east might lead to greater fortune. Because beyond Venice, far beyond the familiar waters of the Mediterranean, the world itself is changing. A new empire is rising across the grasslands and deserts of Asia. Horsemen from Mongolia are building the largest land empire the world has ever seen. Roads once considered deadly are slowly becoming safer beneath Mongol rule. And although the people of Venice do not fully understand it yet, the distance between Europe and Asia is beginning to shrink. Not physically, but psychologically. For the first time in generations, Europeans are starting to imagine that the East might truly be reachable, and one young Venetian boy will eventually follow that dream farther than almost anyone else. Or at least, farther than anyone would believe. The mornings in Venice begin before sunrise, long before church bells echo across the canals, before merchants unlock their warehouses, before bakers slide fresh bread into warm ovens. The harbor is already awake. You hear it first. The soft groan of wood against water, oars dipping quietly into the lagoon, sailors muttering through cold morning air, while lanterns sway gently above the docks like sleepy orange stars. Marco Polo grows up listening to those sounds, not as something unusual, but as the ordinary rhythm of life. His father is rarely home. That, too, feels ordinary. In Venice, many children are raised this way. Fathers vanish onto merchant voyages for months or years at a time. Some sail toward Constantinople, others travel south toward Alexandria. A few disappear farther east into places spoken of almost like dreams. And always there is uncertainty. Ships may return late, or damaged, or not at all. A child in Venice learns early that the sea gives and takes without explanation. Marco's mother dies while he is still young. The details are blurred now beneath centuries of missing records and fading ink. But historians believe he spends much of his childhood raised by extended family, while his father, Marco Polo, continues trading abroad. It creates a strange kind of upbringing, not lonely exactly. Venice itself is too crowded and noisy for loneliness to settle completely, but there is a feeling of incompleteness hanging quietly over merchant households. An empty chair at dinner. Stories told about men currently somewhere beyond the Black Sea. Women standing near windows when ships arrive, trying to recognize familiar faces from a distance. Venice becomes a city built partly upon waiting, and yet the waiting is mixed with ambition, because every returning ship carries possibility. One evening, you might sit beside a canal and hear whispers about silver markets in Crimea. Another night, sailors speak about Mongol horsemen crossing endless grasslands farther east. The details are inconsistent. The distances feel impossible, but the stories continue arriving all the same, like tides that never entirely stop. Young Marco listens carefully. You can imagine him moving quietly through crowded Venetian streets, hearing fragments of conversations from taverns and docks. A merchant arguing over pepper prices, a sailor describing storms near Cyprus, a weary traveler swearing that somewhere beyond Persia there are cities larger than all of Europe combined. Most adults laugh at such claims. Then they repeat them anyway, because Venice runs on curiosity almost as much as commerce. Marco receives the kind of education expected for a merchant's son. Not the education of a monk or noble scholar, but something more practical, useful, grounded in numbers, languages, memory, and negotiation. He learns arithmetic because merchants survive through calculation. He learns reading and writing because contracts matter. He learns geography not as an academic subject, but as a map of opportunities and dangers. Which ports are safe? Which rulers demand heavy taxes? Which routes freeze during winter? Which seas attract pirates? Even language itself becomes a tool rather than a luxury. French is useful for trade. Greek opens doors with Byzantine merchants. A few Arabic words may help in eastern ports. In Venice, languages are less about poetry and more about survival. A misunderstanding in conversation can lose a fortune faster than a storm. Still, the city offers more than practical lessons. It offers imagination. The Rialto market remains Marco's greatest classroom. There, the world gathers in pieces small enough to hold in your hand. Ivory carvings from Africa, silk from distant eastern workshops, tiny glass bottles carrying perfumes that smell faintly of flowers Marco has never seen. Sometimes merchants spread maps across wooden tables beneath oil lamps. The maps are never entirely accurate. Coastlines bend strangely. Mountains drift across parchment like wrinkles. Entire regions remain blank, except for sea monsters or uncertain notes written in hurried ink. But those blank spaces are important. Blank spaces invite dreams. And while Marco is growing up among canals and warehouses, something extraordinary is happening far beyond Venice. The Mongols are reshaping the world. News travels slowly in the 13th century, but eventually, even Venice begins to understand the scale of what has happened. Riders from the eastern grasslands have conquered territories stretching farther than most Europeans can comfortably imagine. Kingdom after kingdom falls beneath Mongol armies. Some cities surrender and survive. Others resist and disappear almost completely. The stories arriving in Venice sound terrifying at first. Horsemen moving faster than armies should move. Entire populations fleeing westward. Smoke rising from cities no Venetian has ever visited, yet somehow fears anyway. But merchants soon notice another side to Mongol rule. The roads are becoming safer. Not peaceful exactly. The Mongols can be unimaginably brutal. But they are also practical rulers, and practical rulers understand that trade creates wealth. Bandits are punished harshly. Caravan routes become more organized. Relay stations appear across enormous distances where travelers can rest, change horses, eat warm food, and continue onward. Slowly, almost quietly, Asia begins opening itself to long-distance travel, in a way unseen for generations. A merchant sitting in Venice may now hear something astonishing. A person could theoretically travel from the Black Sea all the way to the eastern edge of Asia beneath Mongol protection. The idea feels absurd and deeply tempting. One winter evening, a sailor returning from the eastern Mediterranean leans beside a tavern fire, describing Mongol relay. Stations stretching across the steppe, fresh horses waiting at regular intervals, guards protecting roads that once belonged to thieves and raiders. Nearby merchants listen while pretending not to seem impressed. One man quietly spills wine onto his sleeve after hearing how quickly messages can travel across the Mongol world. Compared to this enormous Eastern network, many European kingdoms suddenly feel very small and very slow. Marco hears these stories during the years when childhood slowly gives way to adolescence, and without realizing it, he is being prepared for a different kind of life. Not the life of a knight defending a castle wall, not the life of a monk sealed inside a monastery, but the life of someone willing to move, to cross borders, to follow roads farther than comfort allows. Because Venice has taught him something subtle from the beginning. The world is larger than what you can see from home, and somewhere beyond the familiar lagoon waters, beyond the Mediterranean winds and crowded Venetian markets, roads are opening eastward toward places that still feel half mythical, places carrying names that sound soft and distant in the candlelight. Cathay, Persia, the court of a ruler called Kublai Khan, and before long, Marco Polo's own family will begin moving toward them. Long before Marco Polo ever crossed a desert or entered the court of Kublai Khan, the world itself had already begun changing beneath the feet of travelers. Quietly at first, then all at once. If you stand in Venice during the early 13th century and listen carefully to the conversations drifting through the markets, you notice something unusual. The stories arriving from the east begin changing tone. At first they sound frightening. Cities burned, kingdoms shattered, horsemen appearing out of enormous grasslands farther east than most Europeans can imagine. The name most often whispered is Genghis Khan. To many Europeans, the Mongols seem less like ordinary invaders and more like a force of weather. Sudden, violent, impossible to stop. Rumors spread faster than accurate information ever can. Some people claim the Mongols drink blood. Others insist they never sleep. Medieval Europe has a talent for exaggeration that would later make Marco Polo feel perfectly at home. But underneath the fear, another reality slowly emerges. The Mongols are building something enormous. Not merely an army, an empire. And not just an empire of conquest, but one connected by roads, communication, trade, and movement on a scale the medieval world has rarely seen before. You begin far from Venice now, out on the wide grasslands of Central Asia. The sky feels impossibly large here. No city walls interrupt the horizon. No cathedral towers rise above the landscape. Only rolling plains stretching beneath cold winds, while mounted riders move across the earth with astonishing speed. The Mongols understand mobility better than almost anyone else alive. European knights fight like heavy iron statues crashing into one another. Mongol riders move differently, faster, lighter, more fluid. They carry several horses during long journeys, switching mounts to preserve strength. Messages travel quickly across the steppe because the riders themselves become part of the landscape, flowing over enormous distances like water running downhill. One exhausted courier arrives at a relay station after sunset. Frost clings to the edges of his sleeves. Stable workers immediately bring him fresh horses, while another man presses a bowl of steaming broth into his hands. He barely rests before riding onward into darkness once again. The empire depends upon motion, and motion requires organization. This becomes one of the Mongols' great historical paradoxes. The same empire capable of terrifying destruction also creates long stretches of stability across Eurasia. Historians later call this period the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace, though the phrase sounds calmer than reality truly was. Peace under the Mongols does not necessarily mean gentleness. It means predictability. Merchants can tolerate danger more easily than uncertainty. If roads remain open, trade survives. And the Mongols, practical as ever, understand that merchants bring wealth, taxes, information, and luxury goods. So caravan routes become safer. Not perfectly safe, of course. A traveler can still freeze in the mountains, die of illness, or lose everything to storms and bandits. But compared to earlier centuries, movement across Asia suddenly becomes far more possible. For the first time in generations, you can imagine traveling from the Mediterranean world deep into Asia beneath the protection of a single enormous political system. The effect upon the medieval imagination is difficult to overstate. Europe had always known Asia existed. Silk, spices, and precious stones had reached Western markets for centuries, but those goods usually arrived through long chains of intermediaries. Arab traders sold to Byzantine merchants. Byzantine merchants sold to Italians. The farther east the products came from, the more mysterious their origins became. Now, however, information begins traveling alongside merchandise. Persian astronomers exchange ideas with Chinese scholars. Travelers carry stories between worlds that once felt almost disconnected. Maps improve slowly. Religious envoys move eastward. Merchants push farther than their fathers dared travel. The world does not become fully connected overnight, but it begins to feel smaller. A Venetian merchant, warming himself beside a brazier one winter evening, may now hear first-hand descriptions of cities thousands of miles away. Not myths, not ancient legends. Actual observations from people who survived the journey and returned. The effect is intoxicating, especially in Venice, because Venice thrives on possibility, and possibility now stretches eastward farther than ever before. There is another reason the Mongols fascinate Europeans. Their empire seems strangely tolerant in certain ways. Mongol rulers care less about converting subjects to one religion, and more about maintaining order and loyalty. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others all exist within the empire's enormous boundaries. This surprises many Europeans deeply. Medieval Europe often tears itself apart over religious differences. Yet in parts of the Mongol world, merchants and diplomats from different faiths negotiate beside one another, beneath the same roof. Practicality matters more than ideology, at least most of the time. And practicality shapes the roads themselves. Relay stations appear across the empire at regular intervals. Travelers carrying official permission can rest, eat, and replace exhausted horses. The Mongols issue tablets of authority, known as paisa, small objects granting safe passage and imperial protection. To modern eyes, the system almost resembles an early international network, not modern globalization exactly. Something older, rougher, held together by horses, discipline, fear, and endless movement. A Persian merchant once described the roads beneath Mongol rule as safer than many city streets had been before the empire rose. Whether that statement was entirely true or not, it reveals how dramatically conditions had changed. Even news begins moving differently. Messages cross astonishing distances through relay riders changing horses at carefully organized stations. Information that once took months may now travel in weeks. A Venetian listening to these reports might feel something subtle begin shifting inside his imagination. Asia no longer seems unreachable. Distant, yes. Dangerous, certainly, but not impossible. And this change matters enormously, because before Europeans can physically explore farther into the world, they must first psychologically believe the world can be crossed. That is the quiet transformation unfolding during Marco Polo's youth. The earth itself has not changed. The mountains remain cold. The deserts remain merciless. The seas remain unpredictable. But the roads between civilizations are slowly opening. And among the merchants paying closest attention are two Venetians already traveling farther east than most people back home would ever dare dream. Marco Polo and his brother, Maffeo. At first, they probably intend nothing extraordinary at all. Just another trading venture. Another profitable journey. But the roads beneath the Mongols have altered the scale of what becomes possible. And soon the Polo family will drift so far from Venice that even they may struggle to believe it themselves. At the beginning, the journey probably did not feel historic. That is often the way with history. People rarely announce that they are about to reshape the future. Most simply wake up, eat breakfast, argue about money, and leave home believing they will eventually return. Marco Polo and his brother Maffeo were merchants first, experienced men, practical men, the sort who understood shipping schedules better than philosophy and trusted reliable contracts more than heroic speeches. When they left Venice in the middle years of the 13th century, they were not setting out to discover Asia. They were following trade. That distinction matters. Modern history sometimes imagines medieval travelers as grand adventurers marching dramatically toward destiny. But merchants usually traveled for quieter reasons. Profit, opportunity, survival. Curiosity, yes, but practical curiosity. A trader wants to know where silk prices are lower, which rulers are stable, which ports remain open during winter storms. And during these years, the Mongol world is creating possibilities no previous generation of Venetian merchants could easily imagine. The Polo brothers first move east through familiar commercial routes, across the Mediterranean, toward Constantinople, the great Byzantine city balanced between Europe and Asia. Even by medieval standards, Constantinople feels astonishing. Golden domes catch the sunlight above crowded harbors. Churches rise beside bustling markets filled with Greek, Armenian, Arab, and Italian traders. The city smells of sea salt, incense, wax, horses, and expensive fabric stored in dark warehouses near the docks. You can imagine Marco and Maffeo walking through those crowded streets beneath layers of wool and fur, discussing exchange rates while ships unload cargo from distant ports. But history refuses to stay still around them. Political instability begins shaking the region. The old balance of power shifts again and again beneath merchant feet. And like many traders throughout history, the Polo brothers adapt by continuing farther east rather than turning home. One decision leads quietly into another. They move north toward the Crimea, crossing waters darkened by winter storms. There they enter trading worlds, already deeply connected to Mongol influence. Caravan routes stretch inland, across enormous distances. Goods continue moving eastward, so do rumors, and eventually, so do the Polo brothers themselves. At some point, their journey stops resembling an ordinary trading expedition. The distances become difficult even to imagine. Weeks pass beneath open skies, then months. The brothers travel through landscapes that feel almost endless compared to the crowded geography of Italy. Vast grasslands, wind-shaped hills, rivers wider than anything near Venice. At night, campfires flicker beneath unfamiliar constellations, while merchants from many cultures share meals beside tethered animals. Persian traders, Turkic guides, Mongol riders. Men speaking languages the Venetians do not fully understand. Yet trade creates its own kind of communication. A shared map scratched into dirt, a gesture toward water. The universal expression of someone calculating whether they are being cheated. Some things never change. One evening in Bukhara, after months that quietly stretch into years, the Polo brothers find themselves stranded by political conflict. Caravans cannot safely continue westward. Returning home becomes difficult. Waiting becomes necessary. And so they remain. Bukhara itself feels like another world compared to Venice. Blue-tiled buildings shimmer beneath dry sunlight. Dust drifts slowly through crowded bazaars filled with carpets, spices, copper lamps, and tired travelers drinking warm tea beneath shaded courtyards. A caravan cook kneels beside a steaming pot, while camels groan irritably nearby. He has spent years moving between cities most Europeans have never heard named aloud. His hands smell permanently of smoke and cumin. He listens with mild amusement while foreign merchants attempt to negotiate in broken fragments of several languages at once. The Silk Roads are not one single road. They are a living network, a web of routes crossing deserts, mountains, river valleys, and cities where cultures constantly meet, mix, and misunderstand one another. And here the Polo brothers encounter something unexpected: opportunity. According to later accounts, Mongol envoys eventually invite Niccolo and Maffeo to travel farther east to meet the ruler of the Mongol Empire himself, Kublai Khan. At first, the name may have sounded almost unreal. A ruler unimaginably distant from Venice, a man governing territories larger than most Europeans can mentally picture. But the Mongol world operates differently from the fragmented politics of medieval Europe. Ambassadors travel, messengers move enormous distances. Foreign merchants can occasionally rise surprisingly high if they prove useful, and the Great Khan is curious about the wider world. That curiosity changes everything. The journey eastward becomes larger now, stranger. The Polo brothers travel across portions of Central Asia, where the horizon seems to dissolve into pale sky. Wind sweeps endlessly across the grasslands. Herds move like dark waves in the distance. Sometimes they stay in caravanserais, fortified roadside inns protecting merchants from weather and thieves. Inside, travelers eat thick soup beside smoky fires, while guards bolt heavy wooden gates against the night. Other evenings they sleep beneath tents, listening to unfamiliar animal sounds somewhere beyond the edge of firelight. The farther east they move, the more Europe begins slipping away, not physically, psychologically. The familiar assumptions of Western Christendom no longer dominate the world around them. The Mongol Empire contains Muslims, Buddhists, Nestorian Christians, Taoists, and many others living beneath one vast political structure. For medieval Europeans, this alone feels astonishing. A world larger and more complicated than expected slowly unfolds before the brothers mile by mile. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is this: the roads continue. Again and again, after every mountain pass or river crossing, there is still more world waiting ahead. A Mongol official eventually provides the brothers with golden tablets of authority, granting protection and assistance along imperial routes. These tablets, known as paisa, function almost like passports within the empire. To exhausted travelers, they must have felt nearly magical. Fresh horses, safe lodging, imperial protection, movement through lands once considered almost unreachable. The Polo brothers likely never intended to travel this far east. But history has a quiet habit of expanding gradually around those willing to keep moving. And somewhere far behind them now, across deserts and seas and mountain roads, Venice continues floating upon its lagoon waters, unaware that two of its merchants are steadily approaching the court of the most powerful ruler on earth, a meeting that will eventually shape the imagination of Europe itself, though at the time, it probably just felt like another long road disappearing into dust. By the time Niccolo and Marco Polo finally return to Venice, many people probably assume they are dead. Years have passed, children have grown older, political alliances have shifted, merchant accounts have been settled without them. In Venice, absence slowly becomes its own kind of ghost. And then one day, the brothers return from the east, carrying stories so extraordinary that even seasoned merchants struggle to believe them completely. A ruler called Kublai Khan, cities beyond imagination, an empire stretching farther than known maps comfortably allow. Most listeners likely react the same way people always react to impossible stories, with fascination and skepticism. But Niccolo Polo carries something unusual back to Venice, a request from the great Khan himself. According to later accounts, Kublai Khan asked the brothers to return eastward, bringing educated Christians and holy oil from Jerusalem. Whether every detail unfolded exactly this way remains uncertain after centuries of retelling. Medieval travel accounts often drift somewhere between memory and performance. Still, the larger truth seems clear enough. The Polo brothers intend to go back, and this time Niccolo brings his son. Marco is around 17 years old when he leaves Venice. 17, an age that feels impossibly young when measured against the scale of the journey ahead. You can imagine the morning of departure. The lagoon is pale beneath early light. Moisture clings to wooden docks. Porters haul cargo toward waiting ships, while gulls wheel overhead crying into the cool air. Marco stands among crates, ropes, folded cloth, and nervous travelers trying not to appear nervous. Venice surrounds him with familiar sounds one last time, water against stone, church bells rolling softly across the canals, merchants arguing before breakfast, with the energy of men who consider financial disagreement a sacred tradition. And somewhere beneath all that ordinary noise sits the quiet realization that he may never fully return to this life again. The ship pulls away slowly. Venice begins shrinking behind him. Its towers soften into mist. For the first time, Marco moves beyond the safe edges of childhood. The early stages of the journey follow known Mediterranean routes. Acre, along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, becomes one of their major stopping points. The city hums with crusaders, merchants, sailors, pilgrims, priests, and opportunists from across the known world. Everything smells of heat, sweat, spices, animals, and sea wind. The medieval Mediterranean is deeply connected, but also deeply unstable. Religious conflict hangs constantly in the background. Kingdoms rise and collapse. Alliances shift quickly. Merchants learn to adapt, because stubbornness tends to shorten life expectancy, rather dramatically. Marco sees all this while still barely more than a boy. He watches sailors unload cargo from Egypt beside armored crusaders, preparing for journeys inland. He hears arguments in languages he cannot identify. He notices how trade continues, even when politics fracture, because merchants, unlike kings, generally prefer roads that remain open. The Polos continue onward. At one stage of the journey, they travel with two Dominican friars, meant to accompany them eastward. The arrangement sounds impressive in theory. Learned religious men carrying Christianity toward the court of the great Khan. In practice, the friars become frightened almost immediately by reports of warfare ahead and turn back early into the expedition. It is one of those wonderfully human details history occasionally preserves. Courage often sounds much stronger before the mountains appear. Marco likely notices this carefully. The world beyond Europe is no longer abstract now. Danger is no longer theoretical. It has shape and distance and weather. The farther east they move, the harsher the landscapes become. The green familiarity of the Mediterranean world slowly gives way to rougher terrain. Armenia rises in cold stone ridges beneath heavy skies. Narrow mountain roads twist above valleys where icy rivers churn below. Travel becomes exhausting. A caravan rarely moves quickly. Animals tire. Weather changes suddenly. Supplies must be protected constantly. A single broken axle or sick camel can delay everyone. At night, the travelers gather around fires beneath unfamiliar stars. Marco begins learning the strange rhythm of long-distance travel. Waiting, walking, watching, listening. There is far less heroism than later legends often imagine. Mostly there is endurance. One evening, after crossing difficult roads through Persia, Marco sits beside a caravan fire, while traders speak softly in the darkness nearby. A man from Central Asia repairs a torn saddle strap with practiced fingers. Another traveler dries damp boots beside glowing embers. Somewhere beyond the circle of light, camels groan with the deep, irritated sounds camels have apparently made since the beginning of time. The air smells of smoke, wool, leather, and dust. Marco watches the sparks drift upward into the cold night. Above him stretches a sky larger than any he has known in Venice. The farther east he travels, the more the world expands. Persia, especially, leaves strong impressions upon travelers from Europe. Ancient cities rise beside dry plains and mountain roads. Markets overflow with carpets, turquoise, metalwork, spices, and fruits unfamiliar to Western eyes. Marco encounters people whose customs differ greatly from his own, yet daily life often remains surprisingly recognizable. Parents soothe children. Merchants argue over prices. Travelers complain about weather. Human beings remain comfortingly consistent across enormous distances. And this may be one of the journey's quietest transformations. Marco does not merely move through foreign places. He begins slowly understanding that the world is much larger, more connected, and more human than many Europeans imagine. Not a collection of monsters and myths, but civilizations. Complex societies with systems, traditions, technologies, and histories older than many Western kingdoms. Of course, the journey remains dangerous. Illness spreads easily along caravan routes. Water becomes precious in dry regions. Political unrest can still close roads unexpectedly. Rumors travel constantly through the caravans. Bandits ahead, war near the frontier, snow blocking passes. Every traveler learns to live partly inside uncertainty, and still the roads continue eastward. Always farther, always beyond the next horizon. As Marco rides deeper into Asia beside his father and uncle, he cannot yet know that he is traveling toward one of the most powerful courts in human history, nor can he know that decades later, in a prison cell far from these deserts and mountains, he will attempt to turn these memories into words. Words that many people will doubt, and millions more will never entirely forget. As the journey continues eastward, the world begins to thin. The air thins first, then the vegetation, then the comforting sense that human beings were ever meant to live in places like these. The roads ahead of Marco Polo and the caravan climb steadily upward into the highlands of Central Asia, toward mountain ranges so vast that medieval travelers often describe them with a kind of stunned humility. The roof of the world. Even the phrase feels heavy with distance. The Pamir Mountains rise cold and enormous beneath pale skies. Snow lingers across rocky slopes long after spring should have arrived. Wind cuts through layers of wool and fur, as though fabric itself has surrendered hope. Travel here becomes slower, harder, more silent. You do not simply pass through mountains like these. You endure them. The caravan stretches carefully across narrow paths, where one misplaced step could send animals tumbling into deep ravines below. Hooves scrape against loose stone. Breathing becomes difficult in the high altitude. Fires burn strangely in the thin air, flickering weakly, as though the flames themselves are exhausted. One local guide kneels before dawn, pressing his rough hand against frozen ground to judge whether the path ahead is safe enough for travel. He says very little. Men who survive these mountains rarely waste energy speaking unless necessary. Marco watches and learns. The farther he moves from Venice, the more survival depends upon observation. Which clouds warn of snow? How to protect water supplies? When silence means danger, The Silk Roads are often imagined romantically now, wrapped in modern images of colorful caravans and adventurous travel. And certainly there are moments of wonder along these routes. But there is also suffering, cold that settles into the bones, blistered feet, illness spreading through exhausted travelers, animals collapsing from strain. A merchant journey across Asia in the 13th century is not tourism. It is endurance, stretched across years. At night, the travelers gather close, around fires sheltered behind stones. The darkness beyond the flames feels immense. Wind moves through the mountains with a low, restless sound, almost like distant waves breaking against cliffs. Marco likely hears stories during these nights. Travelers always tell stories beside fires. It distracts the mind from discomfort. Some stories are practical. Where to find water? Which passes flood after heavy rain? Which towns welcome foreigners? Others drift toward myth. Voices in the desert. Spirits wandering abandoned roads. Entire caravans disappearing into storms. The line between reality and superstition becomes softer in landscapes capable of killing careless people so easily. Eventually, the caravan descends from the mountains toward one of the most feared regions along the Silk Roads, the Taklamakan Desert. Its name is often interpreted to mean something close to enter, and you may never return. Whether the translation is perfectly accurate matters less than the feeling it conveys. This is not a gentle place. The desert stretches outward, beneath a blunt white sky, where heat presses down like weight. Sand and stone dominate the horizon in every direction. Water becomes precious enough to shape every decision. Travelers move cautiously between oasis towns, separated by dangerous distances. A caravan that miscalculates supplies may simply vanish. Even sound behaves strangely here. Wind sweeps across dry ground, carrying faint echoes that seem almost human at times. Marco later writes about desert travelers hearing voices calling to them from the darkness, luring them away from the safety of the caravan. Modern historians debate whether these accounts describe folklore, exhaustion, shifting wind patterns, or simple fear. Probably all of them together. The human mind grows fragile in harsh landscapes. One evening, after a long day crossing dry terrain, a camel handler carefully checks leather water skins beside the campfire. His face is cracked from sun and wind. Nearby, several exhausted merchants sleep almost immediately after eating, too tired even for conversation. The camels remain awake longer. They chew slowly in the darkness, with expressions suggesting deep disappointment in humanity as a species. To be fair, the camels may have a point. Still, the caravan survives, and between the dangerous stretches of wilderness come moments of startling beauty. Buddhist monasteries cling to cliff faces high above narrow valleys. Painted caves glow softly with fading murals, created centuries earlier by artists following trade routes across Asia. Orchard towns appear suddenly beside rivers, green against the dry earth like fragments of another world. Marco witnesses civilizations layered across enormous distances, Persian influences mixing with Turkic traditions, Chinese goods appearing in Central Asian markets, religious pilgrims sharing roads with merchants and diplomats. The medieval world is far more connected than many later people imagine. Not modern, not fast, but connected. And as Marco travels farther east, he begins developing the habits that will later shape his famous book. He notices systems, trade patterns, distances, resources, administration. He watches like a merchant, noticing where grain comes from, how taxes are collected, which roads remain busy, which cities feel prosperous. This becomes one of the most important differences between Marco Polo and many medieval storytellers. He often pays attention to practical details, not only wonders. That practical eye later convinces many historians that, despite exaggerations and uncertainties, Marco truly traveled farther east than most Europeans of his era. Because liars often invent dramatic fantasies, but merchants remember boring logistics. And strangely enough, the boring details are often the most believable. The roads continue onward for months. Dust gathers permanently in clothing. Saddles wear thin. Travelers age beneath sun, wind, exhaustion, and constant movement. Yet with every difficult mile, The east grows less mythical, more real, and somewhere beyond the deserts and mountain roads lies the court of Kublai Khan, ruler of the Yuan dynasty, master of an empire so immense that Marco still cannot fully imagine it. Soon the caravan will finally arrive there, and Europe's understanding of Asia will slowly begin to change forever. After years of roads, mountains, dust, river crossings, bitter cold, and endless movement eastward, the journey finally begins to change. Not because the land becomes easier, but because the scale of power surrounding the travelers suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. The caravan now moves through territories fully shaped by the authority of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China. His empire stretches across enormous distances, linking forests, deserts, cities, grasslands, ports, and trade routes beneath one vast political structure. For Marco Polo, the effect must have felt almost disorienting. Europe in the 13th century is fragmented. Kingdoms compete constantly. Roads shift between rival rulers. Borders feel unstable and uncertain. But here, deep within the Mongol world, authority feels broader, more centralized, more confident. The roads themselves seem to know who rules them. Travelers carry official permissions. Relay stations operate with disciplined regularity. Messengers ride beneath imperial protection. Taxes are collected. Supplies move steadily across enormous territories. The empire breathes like one enormous organism, and somewhere near the heart of it waits the great Khan himself. Marco eventually reaches Chengdu, known in later European imagination as Xanadu. Even centuries later, the name still carries the softness of legend. But for Marco, this is not fantasy. It is a real court, filled with real people, real politics, real servants, real guards, and real expectations. The first impression is scale. Everything feels large. The hunting grounds stretch outward for miles. Pavilions rise across open landscapes beside carefully arranged gardens and artificial lakes. Silk banners move gently in the wind, while mounted guards patrol enormous compounds with practiced precision. You hear bells first, small silver bells hanging from horse harnesses, then the movement of animals. Falcons shifting restlessly upon leather gloves, horses snorting clouds into cool morning air, hunting dogs pulling impatiently against their handlers. The court is constantly moving. Unlike many European rulers who govern from permanent stone castles, Kublai Khan maintains elements of the older Mongol tradition of mobility. Parts of the imperial household shift seasonally between different residences and hunting grounds. The empire itself seems restless, alive. A young court servant moves quietly through evening corridors, lighting hanging lanterns one by one as dusk settles over the palace complex. Silk curtains stir softly in the night breeze. Somewhere deeper inside the court, musicians begin playing instruments Marco has never heard before. Their melodies rise and fall gently through the darkness like unfamiliar birdsong. For a Venetian merchant's son, raised among narrow canals and crowded stone streets, the experience must feel almost unreal, not because the court resembles fantasy, but because it is so organized, so wealthy, so enormous. Marco later describes cities and administrative systems far beyond what most Europeans expect Asia to contain. To many Western readers, the East still exists, partly inside myth. Distant lands are imagined as vague places filled with monsters, miracles, or biblical mysteries. But the Yuan court feels practical, disciplined, structured. The great Khan governs through systems. That detail fascinates Marco more than exotic spectacle alone. Kublai Khan himself is already older by the time Marco arrives, heavy in body, powerful in presence, experienced in rule. He is not merely a conqueror. He is an administrator trying to hold together one of the largest empires in human history, and empires require information. This becomes important. The Mongol rulers often value useful foreigners because outsiders may serve loyally without becoming trapped in local rivalries. Merchants especially possess skills valuable to empire: languages, adaptability, negotiation, observation. Marco later claims he served the Khan in various official capacities, possibly traveling on diplomatic or administrative assignments. Historians continue debating exactly how large his role truly was. Some believe Marco exaggerated his importance. Others argue he may indeed have worked within parts of the imperial administration, though perhaps not at the high levels later readers imagined. The truth remains uncertain, but uncertainty itself belongs naturally to medieval history. Records fade, documents disappear, memories shift shape over time. And yet many of Marco's observations about the empire prove surprisingly accurate. That accuracy begins with simple things: the movement of goods, the organization of roads, the wealth flowing through cities, the disciplined structure of imperial communication. Marco notices these details because he has been trained to notice systems. A knight entering the court might focus upon military glory. A priest might focus upon religion. But a merchant sees movement, resources, administration. He notices how grain travels, how taxes operate, how markets function, how roads connect distant regions together. In many ways, Marco Polo observes Asia less like a conqueror and more like an accountant who accidentally wandered into one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. And somehow that makes his descriptions more believable. One afternoon, Marco watches imperial officials reviewing supply records while servants carry stacks of documents through shaded halls. Ink brushes move steadily across paper. Couriers arrive from distant provinces coated in road dust. Nearby, translators quietly shift conversations between several languages. The empire sounds busy, not mystical. That distinction matters enormously later when his book reaches Europe. Because Marco does not only describe wonders, he describes infrastructure. And strangely enough, the infrastructure astonishes people almost as much as the wonders do. There are moments of beauty too, of course. Gardens perfumed with flowers, silk garments shimmering beneath lantern light, banquets where silver bowls reflect firelight across polished tables. Yet even these displays of luxury serve political purpose. They demonstrate the reach of imperial wealth, the stability of rule, the ability to gather resources from across continents. Marco slowly realizes something profound during these years. Europe is not the center of the world, not economically, not technologically, not administratively. For many modern listeners, that realization may sound obvious, but for a medieval Venetian merchant standing within the court of Kublai Khan, it changes the psychological shape of the earth itself. And years later, when Marco attempts to describe this world back home, many Europeans will struggle deeply to believe him. Because sometimes the hardest thing for human beings to accept is not fantasy, but scale. Marco would later claim he remained within the orbit of the Khan's world for nearly 17 years, long enough for distant roads to begin feeling almost familiar, long enough for Venice itself to become dreamlike in memory. At first, everything around Marco Polo must have felt overwhelming. Not only the scale of the empire, but the rhythm of it, the speed, the movement, the constant flow of information, officials, animals, goods, messengers, and travelers moving through the court of Kublai Khan like water through a vast canal system. In Venice, Marco had grown up in a city shaped by trade. But here, in the Yuan world, trade operated on a scale unlike anything Europe could yet imagine. And slowly, over months and years, Marco began adapting to it. You can picture him at first, speaking cautiously through translators, listening more than talking, watching court customs carefully, learning which gestures mattered, which officials carried real influence, which roads remained open during winter, which governors could be trusted. Empires survive through observation, and Marco, whatever else he may have been, was observant. This becomes one of the quiet strengths of his story. He does not describe Asia only through mystery or spectacle. He notices systems, patterns, practical details, the machinery beneath imperial life. That merchant perspective shapes everything he later writes. One morning, before sunrise, a tax clerk sits beside a low wooden table, reviewing travel permits by lantern light. He presses seals carefully into paper documents while outside. Horses stamp against frozen ground, waiting for departure orders. The clerk's sleeves smell faintly of ink and smoke. Nearby, couriers prepare to leave for distant provinces, carrying messages that may travel hundreds of miles through relay stations across the empire. To Marco, these scenes matter, not because they are dramatic, because they work. That distinction separates Marco Polo from many medieval storytellers. He often sounds impressed by efficiency, and efficiency can seem surprisingly magical when you come from a fragmented medieval Europe, where roads wash away, kingdoms feud endlessly, and official communication often moves slower than exhausted livestock. The Mongol administration fascinates him because it feels connected. Roads link distant regions together. Officials gather census information. Taxes move through organized systems. Couriers carry imperial orders quickly across enormous territories. None of this makes the empire perfect, of course. The Mongols remain capable of immense brutality. Entire cities had once burned beneath their campaigns. Fear still helps hold the empire together. But alongside that harshness exists administrative discipline, and Marco notices both. He begins traveling farther within the empire, possibly on assignments connected to the Khan's administration, though historians remain uncertain about the exact nature of his duties. Some later readers imagined Marco as an important governor or close advisor. Modern scholars tend to approach those claims more cautiously. Still, it seems entirely plausible that Marco traveled widely while serving in lesser administrative or diplomatic roles. Useful foreigners often moved through Mongol systems precisely because they stood outside local rivalries, and Marco possessed valuable skills. Languages, adaptability, commercial knowledge, the ability to survive long journeys without collapsing emotionally every time conditions became uncomfortable, which already placed him ahead of many Europeans. One afternoon, Marco rides beside a canal, crowded with barges, carrying grain toward major cities farther north. Laborers pull heavy boats steadily along the water, while officials record shipments from shaded stations near the banks. The canal seems endless, orderly, busy. Marco realizes something subtle but important. This empire feeds cities on a scale Europe rarely experiences. Food moves through organized networks. Rivers and canals function like arteries carrying life between provinces. Grain, salt, silk, ceramics, paper, metals, and taxes all flow steadily across the landscape. The empire survives through movement, and movement requires administration. A European knight might barely notice these things. Marco notices immediately. Sometimes his attention almost resembles that of a merchant studying inventory. He counts distances, observes prices, records local products, notes where salt is produced and how taxes are collected, and oddly enough, these practical details later become some of the strongest evidence supporting portions of his story. Because fantasy writers usually invent dramatic wonders, but merchants remember logistics. At the same time, Marco is still deeply foreign inside this world. The languages surrounding him shift constantly. Mongolian, Persian, Turkic dialects, Chinese languages, and others echo through marketplaces and government compounds. Translators remain essential in many situations, yet Marco adapts gradually. The Silk Roads reward flexibility. Rigid travelers rarely survive long. One evening, inside a crowded market street lit by hanging lanterns, Marco watches merchants from several regions bargaining at once. Silk brushes softly against wool garments. Copper coins clink across wooden counters. Steam rises from cooking pots, carrying unfamiliar scents of ginger, garlic, sesame oil, and broth into the night air. Nearby, two traders argue passionately over transport fees while a child chases a loose chicken directly through the middle of an expensive fabric stall. Even enormous empires remain gloriously vulnerable to ordinary chaos. The market sounds alive, not exotic in the shallow way later European fantasies sometimes imagined Asia. Human, busy, complicated. This is another quiet transformation happening inside Marco's worldview. The East gradually stops feeling mythical. It becomes tangible. Real cities, real roads, real governments, real people trying to solve practical problems. And because Marco sees the world through movement and trade, he begins understanding something many medieval Europeans cannot yet fully grasp. Civilizations are connected, not perfectly, not peacefully, but continuously. Goods move, Ideas move. Technologies move. Stories move. The Silk Roads are not simply roads carrying luxury items westward. They are channels through which entire ways of understanding the world slowly travel between civilizations. Marco himself becomes part of that process without fully realizing it. Years later, when Europeans read his descriptions of Asian cities, roads, markets, postal systems, and technologies, many readers will react with disbelief. Not because the descriptions sound magical, because they sound organized. And sometimes organized reality feels harder to believe than fantasy. As evening settles across the imperial roads, Marco watches another relay rider disappear into the growing darkness, carrying messages toward provinces he himself may never see. The empire stretches onward, beyond the horizon, again and again. And soon Marco will encounter cities so vast that many Europeans back home will struggle even to imagine them. For years, Marco Polo had crossed landscapes that seemed endless: mountains, deserts, grasslands, long roads dissolving into dust beneath caravan wheels. But eventually the journey begins changing once again. The emptiness gives way to density. The roads grow busier. Traffic thickens. Canals widen. Villages become towns. And towns slowly gather themselves into something far larger than most Europeans of the 13th century could comfortably imagine. Cities. Not merely large cities. Immense ones. The closer Marco travels toward the great urban centers of the Yuan dynasty, the more movement surrounds him. Grain barges crowd waterways. Caravans arrive continuously through guarded gates. Messengers ride between administrative compounds, carrying sealed documents beneath imperial authority. The empire feels alive with circulation, and at the center of much of that circulation stands Kambalik, the great capital later associated with modern Beijing. To many Europeans hearing Marco's descriptions years later, the city sounds impossible, not because it contains dragons or magic, because it contains scale. Medieval European cities are often crowded, noisy, and important within their own regions. Venice itself is wealthy and sophisticated. Constantinople towers above much of Europe in grandeur. But the cities Marco describes seem to belong to another category entirely. Larger, more organized, more populated, more connected. One morning before dawn, a boatman guides a grain barge slowly along the Grand Canal, beneath pale mist rising from the water. Other barges move beside him, carrying rice, timber, ceramics, salt, and bundles of silk protected beneath woven covers. The canal stretches onward mile after mile, like a man-made river, binding distant regions together. Laborers shout softly from the banks. Officials inspect cargo manifests beneath covered stations. Waterbirds drift lazily near the reeds, while the city slowly awakens around them. Marco watches all this with a merchant's eye, and what astonishes him most is not luxury alone. It is coordination. The Grand Canal itself feels extraordinary to a Venetian traveler. Europe certainly possesses rivers and trade routes, but this system operates on astonishing scale. Entire provinces feed major cities through carefully maintained networks of waterways and transport routes. Food arrives constantly. Goods circulate continuously. The empire sustains urban populations larger than many Europeans believe possible, and the cities themselves pulse with activity. Kambalik overwhelms the senses. Wide streets crowded with merchants, animals, laborers, officials, soldiers, monks, travelers, entertainers, and servants moving in every direction. Market districts spill outward beneath hanging signs and bright fabrics. Smoke rises from food stalls where cooks prepare noodles, dumplings, soups, roasted meats, and steaming rice for endless streams of customers. The smells shift constantly as you walk. Wood smoke, sesame oil, cooked garlic, wet earth after rain, tea brewing somewhere nearby. Marco later claims some cities contained populations in the millions, though medieval numbers are notoriously difficult to verify precisely. Even allowing for exaggeration, however, there is little doubt that the great cities of China dwarfed most urban centers in Europe during this period. And this realization unsettles the European imagination in quiet ways, because medieval Europeans often imagine themselves living near the center of civilization. Marco's descriptions challenge that assumption. One afternoon, he watches workers repairing a busy market road while officials supervise traffic flow nearby. The task itself is unremarkable. Roads require maintenance everywhere, but the number of workers astonishes him. The organization astonishes him. The sheer density of urban life astonishes him. In Venice, movement often happens through waterways and narrow streets, shaped by centuries of gradual growth. Kambalik feels different, planned, structured, deliberate, like a city imagined at imperial scale from the beginning. Even the markets reveal the empire's reach. Goods arrive from astonishing distances, spices from Southeast Asia, horses from the steppe, precious stones from Central Asia, Persian textiles, Chinese ceramics, rare woods, medicines, metals, paper. Everything moves. The Mongol Empire has not erased cultural differences across Eurasia, but it has connected them through trade routes, administration, and relative stability in ways few earlier empires achieved. Marco begins understanding the East not as a distant edge of the world, but as a center of gravity in its own right. That psychological shift matters enormously, because once Europe begins imagining Asia as real, wealthy, organized and reachable, curiosity changes shape. The East no longer feels like pure legend. It becomes a destination, a possibility, and possibilities have consequences. Of course, Marco also notices ordinary human life continuing beneath all the imperial grandeur. Children run through crowded streets, chasing one another between market stalls. Elderly merchants sit, wrapped in layered robes, sipping hot drinks while discussing prices. Laborers nap briefly beside stacked cargo during afternoon heat. An empire may appear enormous from a distance, but up close, it is still made of people trying to finish their daily work before evening. One evening, as lanterns begin glowing across the canals and marketplaces, Marco pauses beside a busy bridge crowded with travelers crossing in both directions. Beneath him, boats glide through darkening water, carrying grain towards storage depots farther north. The city hums like a living hive. That comparison would have felt natural to medieval observers. Bees moving endlessly through organized motion, each creature contributing to something larger than itself. And perhaps for the first time in his life, Marco fully understands that Europe is not the largest world that exists. It is simply one region among many, a realization both humbling and strangely exciting. Years later, when readers in Venice, Genoa, Paris, and beyond encounter these descriptions, many will react with disbelief. Some will assume Marco exaggerated wildly. Others will become fascinated, but nearly all of them will feel something important shifting beneath the old boundaries of the medieval imagination. Because Marco Polo is not merely describing cities. He is describing a world far larger than Europe expected. And soon, he will describe something even stranger than the cities themselves: paper money, black stones that burn, and systems of government so unusual that many Western readers will initially mistake them for fantasy. At first, the cities themselves seem impossible enough. Their size, their crowds, their endless movement of goods and people. But as Marco Polo spends more time within the Yuan Empire, he begins noticing things even stranger to European eyes than enormous cities, small things, ordinary things, the kinds of details people living inside a civilization barely notice anymore. And sometimes ordinary details are the hardest for outsiders to believe. One winter morning, Marco watches government workers, seated behind long wooden tables, beneath a hall, warmed by charcoal braziers. Officials count stacks of paper notes, while merchants wait nearby, carrying sealed bags of silver, silk, spices, and tax records. The room smells faintly of ink, smoke, damp wool, and heated metal. At first glance, the papers seem unimpressive, thin, light, fragile, and yet everyone in the room treats them seriously. Because they are money. To Marco, raised in the merchant culture of Venice, where wealth depends heavily upon precious metals, the idea feels astonishing. Paper money, not symbolic records of value, actual currency issued by the state itself. The Yuan administration produces notes using carefully controlled materials and official seals. Under imperial authority, people across large portions of the empire accept these papers in exchange for goods, labor, taxes, and trade. Marco later describes the process with fascination. And when Europeans eventually read those descriptions, many assume he must be exaggerating or inventing fantasy altogether, because in medieval Europe, wealth feels physical. Gold, silver, coins heavy enough to hold. Paper seems absurdly delicate by comparison. One Venetian banker, hearing such a story years later, might stare silently into his wine cup, wondering how an empire survives after deciding to base its economy upon expensive-looking stationery. Yet the system works, at least within the structure maintained by imperial authority. Marco slowly realizes that the strength behind the paper is not the material itself. It is trust. Trust in the power of the state, trust in administration, trust that the empire can enforce value across enormous distances. That realization quietly impresses him, because once again, the Mongol world reveals itself not merely as wealthy, but organized. One clerk carefully presses seals onto fresh notes, while another records tax exchanges in neat columns beside him. Nearby, merchants accept the paper with little visible concern, folding it into layered robes before returning to the crowded streets outside. The entire process feels strangely modern to Marco's European eyes. And paper money is only the beginning. Marco also encounters fuel unlike anything common in Europe. Black stones that burn. Coal. In northern China, coal is already widely used for heating and industry, long before it becomes common across much of Europe. Marco describes people digging dark stones from the earth and burning them for warmth. To many later European readers, this also sounds improbable. Stones are not supposed to burn. Wood burns. Charcoal burns. But black rocks pulled from the ground? The idea feels unnatural. And yet, during harsh winters, Marco witnesses entire districts warmed by coal fires. Smoke rises steadily above rooftops into cold evening air, while furnaces glow deep orange behind workshop walls. One metalworker wipes soot from his hands, while feeding another shovelful of coal into a roaring furnace. Sparks burst upward through the smoke, like tiny golden insects, before vanishing into darkness. The heat is intense, steady, powerful. Again and again, Marco encounters technologies and systems that force him to reconsider assumptions carried from Europe. Printing, paper administration, canal logistics, large-scale manufacturing, even the organization of communication continues astonishing him. Imperial messages travel through relay networks with remarkable speed. Officials maintain records carefully. Supplies move through coordinated systems stretching across provinces. The empire depends upon information as much as military force. And perhaps this becomes one of the greatest hidden shocks inside Marco's future book. Not that Asia contains wonders. Europe already expects distant lands to contain wonders. The true surprise is competence. The East in Marco's descriptions often appears sophisticated, orderly, wealthy, and technologically capable in ways that challenge European assumptions about civilization itself. That is far more unsettling than fantasy monsters would have been. One afternoon, Marco watches workers unloading bundles of printed paper near an administrative compound. Sheets covered in carefully arranged characters, dry on racks, while nearby officials organize documents for transport. Books exist in Europe, of course, but they are expensive and labor-intensive, copied slowly by hand. The scale of printing in China impresses Marco deeply, even if he cannot fully grasp how transformative such technologies may eventually become elsewhere in the world. Still, he notices. He always notices. That practical merchant attention continues shaping his observations. He may not fully understand every invention he encounters, but he recognizes systems producing wealth, organization, and efficiency. And because Marco writes about these details later with such confidence, his readers become divided. Some are fascinated, others deeply skeptical. After all, if someone returned from the East claiming paper could function as money, stones could replace firewood, cities contained unimaginable populations, and imperial systems coordinated entire continents, would you believe him immediately? Probably not. Especially in medieval Europe, where distances distort stories quickly, And yet many of Marco's descriptions eventually prove remarkably accurate, not perfect, not flawless, but grounded in realities far more advanced than many Western readers expected Asia to contain. One evening, as snow drifts softly outside the city walls, government workers continue counting paper notes beneath warm lantern light, while coal fires burn steadily nearby. The empire moves through ink, paper, roads, smoke, and information. Marco watches carefully, and somewhere deep inside his memory, these images begin settling into stories he will someday try to explain to a doubtful Europe. A Europe not yet ready to decide whether he is a witness or a fabulist. For many years after Marco Polo's return, readers argued about his stories in taverns, courts, monasteries, and merchant houses across Europe. Some listeners were enchanted, others were suspicious almost immediately, and over the centuries the questions only grew louder. Did Marco Polo truly travel as far as he claimed? Did he really spend years within the world of Kublai Khan? Or had he simply gathered stories from other travelers and woven them into one enormous narrative? The debate never fully disappears. Even now, hundreds of years later, historians still sit beneath library lamps, quietly arguing over the details. And strangely enough, many of the arguments begin not with what Marco described, but with what he did not. One winter evening, long after Marco's death, a monk bends over a manuscript copy of the Travels beneath flickering candlelight. Snow presses softly against the outer walls of the monastery, while cold air slips through tiny cracks in the stone. The monk pauses occasionally, frowning slightly at certain passages. Then he continues copying, line after line, word after word. Like many medieval readers, he senses both wonder and uncertainty living together inside the text. The most famous questions emerge centuries later. Why does Marco Polo never clearly mention the Great Wall? Why does he say so little about tea? Why are chopsticks almost entirely absent from his descriptions? Why does he not discuss foot binding in greater detail? To modern readers, these omissions can seem deeply suspicious, especially because these elements now feel strongly associated with Chinese history and culture. The argument appears straightforward at first. If Marco truly lived for years in China, how could he fail to mention such important things? And yet the deeper historians look, the more complicated the question becomes. The Great Wall, for example, did exist in earlier forms before Marco's lifetime. But the enormous stone structure most people imagine today largely belongs to the later Ming dynasty, built after the Mongol period. During the Yuan era, the old walls may not have appeared especially impressive or central to daily life. To Marco, they may simply have seemed unremarkable, or perhaps he passed regions where they mattered less. Tea presents another puzzle. Marco mentions many foods and customs, but not tea with the attention modern readers expect. Yet historians quietly remind us of something important. People rarely describe what feels ordinary to those around them. A medieval traveler visiting Venice might never bother writing extensively about loaf bread or wine because they appear everywhere. Tea in parts of China may have felt similarly commonplace. Chopsticks create another curious silence. And foot binding, while certainly practiced during portions of the period, may not have been as universal or publicly visible during the Yuan dynasty as later assumptions sometimes suggest. The further historians examine these omissions, the less simple the mystery becomes. Medieval texts are fragile things. They pass through generations of copying, editing, translating, and accidental alteration. Entire paragraphs disappear. Details change. Scribes simplify confusing sections, or quietly insert clarifications of their own. There is no single untouched original version of Marco Polo's book resting safely somewhere beneath glass. Instead, there are many manuscript traditions, drifting through history, like branches from the same tree. And branches change shape. One tired scribe in France may shorten descriptions. Another in Italy may adjust wording for local readers. A translator generations later may misunderstand unfamiliar terms completely. The story itself keeps moving, changing slightly each time new hands copy it. This uncertainty becomes part of Marco Polo's strange legacy. He exists somewhere between witness and storyteller, history and literature, observation and performance. That ambiguity unsettles modern readers because we prefer clear categories: true, false, reliable, invented. But medieval travel writing rarely behaves so neatly. One scholar many centuries later sits beside a cluttered desk surrounded by maps, manuscript copies, and handwritten notes. She studies Marco's descriptions line by line, searching for clues hidden inside practical details. Outside, rain taps softly against the library windows. She notices something curious. Marco often sounds most convincing when discussing ordinary systems. Postal routes, salt taxes, distances between cities, methods of administration. The less dramatic the detail, the more believable it often becomes. And this creates the central paradox of Marco Polo. Some of his grandest claims seem doubtful, yet many smaller observations prove remarkably accurate, almost too accurate for someone who never traveled east at all. This is why the debate never settles completely, because the evidence refuses to arrange itself into perfect certainty. Perhaps Marco exaggerated portions of his story. Quite likely, perhaps Rustichello da Pisa, the romance writer who helped shape the book in prison, added dramatic touches for medieval audiences. Also likely. But exaggeration does not automatically erase the journey itself. Human memory is rarely precise, especially after decades. Stories expand gradually during retelling. Distances grow longer. Events become smoother. Strange moments sharpen into symbolic scenes, and medieval audiences expected storytelling to contain performance. Absolute factual precision mattered less than vividness, meaning, and wonder. Marco Polo's readers were not modern historians with footnotes and archival catalogues. They were merchants, nobles, monks, sailors, and dreamers listening beside firelight. The important question for many of them was not, is every detail perfectly accurate? The question was, could the world truly be this large? And Marco answered yes. That answer alone changed something profound inside Europe's imagination. Even now, the uncertainty surrounding him feels strangely fitting, because Marco Polo did not simply travel through distant places. He traveled through the blurry frontier, where memory becomes story. And somewhere inside that blur, truth continues flickering softly like candlelight behind old parchment. Yet despite all the doubts, many historians eventually arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. Marco somehow knew too much, too many practical details, too many accurate observations about systems most Europeans had never seen, and those details would soon become very important indeed. The strange thing about Marco Polo's story is that the farther historians investigate it, the less simple it becomes. Because alongside the omissions, exaggerations, and uncertainties sit details that feel stubbornly real. Small details, quiet details, the sort of details that rarely appear in fantasy. And over time, many scholars began noticing something important. Marco often sounds most believable when he stops trying to impress anyone. One freezing morning, somewhere along an imperial relay road, a courier arrives at a roadside station, coated in snow and horse sweat. Stable workers hurry forward, carrying lanterns, while another official records the arrival time onto a wooden tablet. Fresh horses wait nearby beneath shelter. Warm broth steams inside heavy bowls. The exhausted rider barely pauses before continuing onward into the winter darkness, carrying sealed government messages across the empire. Scenes like this appear repeatedly inside Marco's descriptions. Not dramatic battles, not mythical creatures, infrastructure. The postal relay system of the Mongol Empire becomes one of the strongest examples. Marco describes organized stations positioned across long distances where official messengers could rest, replace animals, gather supplies, and continue quickly onward. At the time, many European readers likely viewed such efficiency with disbelief, but historians now know these relay networks truly existed. The Mongols depended upon communication to govern their enormous territories. Messages, census records, military orders, tax information, and diplomatic reports moved continuously across Eurasia through carefully maintained routes. Marco's descriptions of these systems align surprisingly well with Persian, Chinese, and archaeological evidence. And this keeps happening, again and again. His observations about salt production, for example, often prove remarkably precise. Marco describes regions where salt cakes function almost like currency, and where government control over salt production generates immense revenue. To modern ears, salt may sound uninteresting compared to emperors and caravans, but medieval economies depended heavily upon it. Salt preserved food, sustained trade, generated taxes. Merchants noticed salt because merchants noticed survival. One tax official in southern China supervises laborers shaping salt into hardened blocks, while nearby workers record shipments onto bamboo and paper documents. The air smells sharp and mineral-heavy beneath damp gray skies. Marco pays attention to scenes like this, and historians trust him more because he does. Fantasy writers rarely invent detailed tax systems. He also describes coal use accurately, paper currency, canal transport, large urban populations, the movement of grain through imperial networks. None of these details sound especially romantic, which is precisely why they matter. One scholar once observed that Marco Polo's most convincing passages are often the boring ones. There is wisdom in that idea. Lies tend to chase spectacle. Truth frequently hides inside logistics. Another important point gradually emerges as historians compare Marco's writings against other medieval sources. Certain geographical descriptions match reality surprisingly closely. River systems, trade routes, travel distances, regional products. Even when Marco exaggerates numbers or repeats second-hand stories, the underlying structure often remains grounded in real geography. This does not prove every claim is accurate, but it strongly suggests first-hand experience somewhere within the Mongol world. One evening, beneath soft snowfall near an imperial station, an administrator reviews travel records while relay horses rest nearby under wool coverings. Oil lamps glow against dark wooden walls, while distant bells mark the arrival of another messenger from the north. The empire feels procedural, orderly, documented. Marco's descriptions repeatedly return to that atmosphere, and this becomes deeply important when evaluating his reliability. Because medieval Europeans writing pure fantasy usually focused upon marvels, monsters, miracles, sacred mysteries. Marco often focuses instead upon administration. He notices how systems function, how roads connect provinces, how supplies move, how officials organize information, how governments maintain power across distance. Those observations sound less like fairy tales and more like the practical notes of someone trained in commerce. Of course, uncertainty remains. Historians still debate whether Marco personally visited every location he described. Some sections of the travels clearly include stories gathered from other travelers. Medieval writers rarely separated first-hand experience from reported information with modern precision, and memory itself reshapes journeys over time, especially journeys lasting decades. Still, completely dismissing Marco becomes difficult. He knew too much about certain realities of the Yuan world, particularly realities outsiders rarely discussed. For example, his descriptions of paper money include surprisingly accurate details about official seals, production methods, and state authority backing the currency. Those are not the kinds of specifics a random storyteller in Venice would easily invent. Likewise, his awareness of administrative geography across portions of Asia suggests prolonged exposure to imperial systems. Even if Marco embellished parts of his experience, he likely witnessed far more than many early critics assumed. One of the quiet ironies surrounding Marco Polo is this: the details that convinced medieval audiences were often the wrong ones. Exotic wealth, gigantic numbers, palaces covered in splendor. But the details that convince modern historians are usually the humble ones: taxes, roads, coal, salt, relay horses, canals, paperwork, the ordinary machinery of empire. And perhaps that is fitting, because real civilizations are not built only from dramatic moments. They are built from systems repeating quietly every day. A courier arriving on time, grain reaching a city before winter, officials recording shipments correctly, workers maintaining roads no traveler will ever praise in poetry. Marco understood this instinctively, because he viewed the world through a merchant size, not searching constantly for heroism, searching for how things worked. And in doing so, he accidentally gave Europe something more valuable than fantasy. He gave Europe a glimpse of Asia as a functioning civilization of immense sophistication, not merely distant, not merely mysterious, but organized, reachable, real. That realization would continue spreading slowly through Europe, long after Marco himself faded into old age. And eventually, after many years inside the orbit of the great Khan's empire, the long road home would finally begin. After many years inside the orbit of the great Khan's empire, the time finally comes for the Polos to leave. By now, Marco is no longer the uncertain teenager who once departed Venice beside his father and uncle. The roads of Asia have shaped him slowly across decades. Deserts, courts, markets, mountains, canals, and imperial cities have all settled into his memory like layers of dust upon old traveling clothes. And yet leaving proves difficult, not emotionally alone. Practically, the overland routes westward have grown more unstable in places. Politics shift constantly inside large empires, especially after years of expansion. Travel across Eurasia remains possible, but no longer feels as secure as before. Then an opportunity appears. A Mongol princess named Kokochin is to be escorted westward toward Persia for marriage into a royal family connected to the wider Mongol world. And the Polos join the expedition. The journey that once crossed mountains and deserts will now continue across oceans. The change in atmosphere feels immediate. The Silk Roads had been dry, dusty, wind-carved worlds of hooves, caravans, and stone. The sea is different. Everything breathes. Wood swells with moisture. Rope groans softly at night. Salt gathers across railings and clothing. Lanterns sway endlessly with the movement of water. The ships themselves astonish Marco. Chinese maritime technology during this period often surpasses what many Europeans are accustomed to seeing. Large vessels carry multiple masts, layered decks, private cabins, cargo holds, divided into watertight compartments, and crews capable of navigating enormous distances through seasonal wind systems. One Venetian sailor standing aboard such a vessel might quietly reconsider several assumptions about European superiority while trying not to appear too visibly overwhelmed. The ships feel immense, not elegant in the narrow Mediterranean style Marco once knew, but abroad, capable, almost floating cities themselves. The voyage begins cautiously, southward through crowded ports, alive with trade from across Asia. Spices move through warehouses, beside ceramics, lacquerware, silk, pearls, medicinal herbs, ivory, sandalwood, and carved metalwork. The harbors smell of salt, fish, wet timber, smoke, tar, and tropical rain drifting inland from distant clouds. Marco sees once again how deeply connected the medieval world already is. Arab sailors negotiate beside Chinese merchants. Indian traders supervise cargo transfers, while interpreters move between languages with practiced ease. Buddhist monks, Muslim navigators, merchants, diplomats, laborers, and wandering travelers all pass through the same humid ports beneath forests of ship masts. The world feels enormous and crowded, but sea travel introduces a different kind of uncertainty than caravan roads. On land, danger usually approaches visibly. Storms gather over mountains. Bandits threaten isolated passes. Water supplies run low. At sea, uncertainty surrounds you constantly, from every direction. One evening, sailors work beneath heavy rain, repairing wet ropes, while waves strike rhythmically against the hull below. The deck pitches gently beneath their feet. Far overhead, dark clouds swallow most of the stars. The monsoon season governs everything here. Ships do not simply sail whenever they choose. Captains must understand seasonal wind patterns crossing the Indian Ocean. Entire fleets sometimes wait in harbor for weeks or months until conditions shift favorably. And so the voyage develops long stretches of stillness between bursts of danger. Waiting becomes part of survival. Crews repair sails. Merchants count inventory repeatedly. Passengers stare toward gray horizons while humid air presses against skin and clothing. The sea teaches patience, whether people desire the lesson or not. Princess Kokochin herself remains mostly quiet, inside the surviving historical accounts, almost drifting through the edges of Marco's narrative like distant music. She is young, traveling far from home toward a political marriage arranged across enormous distances, a human bridge between empires. Her journey reminds Marco once again that diplomacy in the Mongol world stretches across continents. Families, alliances, marriages, and trade networks all move through the same vast system of roads and seas. History often describes empires through battles, but empires also survive through marriages, cargo manifests, weather forecasts, and exhausted sailors trying not to fall overboard during storms, especially the sailors. The ocean treats all social classes with admirable equality. Nobles, merchants, servants, diplomats, and scholars all become equally miserable once seasickness arrives. One unfortunate passenger spends 3 days leaning sadly against a barrel, while experienced sailors step around him with the calm patience of men who have witnessed this exact tragedy hundreds of times before. The voyage continues through dangerous waters bordering Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Storms rise suddenly. Disease spreads aboard crowded ships. Supplies spoil. Some travelers die before reaching Persia. Long-distance sea travel in the medieval world remains brutally uncertain. Marco later describes portions of the voyage, with exhaustion lingering beneath the words themselves. And yet there are moments of beauty too. Warm evenings where the sea reflects moonlight like polished metal. Flying fish scattering above dark waves. Harbor lanterns appearing slowly through tropical mist after weeks at sea. The ocean reshapes time. Days blur together beneath repeating horizons. Eventually the expedition reaches Persia. But even arrival carries sadness. The Mongol ruler meant to marry Kokochin has already died by the time they arrive. Political arrangements shift once again. New negotiations begin. The world continues changing around the travelers, even after surviving the journey. And now, after decades away from Europe, the Polos finally begin moving westward toward home, toward Venice, toward the narrow canals and cold lagoon air Marco has not seen since youth. But return journeys are strange things, because after enough years pass, home itself becomes partly imaginary. And when Marco finally sees Venice again after nearly 24 years away, the city no longer feels entirely familiar. Nor does he. The return to Venice should have felt triumphant, at least in theory. After all, the Polos had survived deserts, mountain passes, imperial courts, sea storms, disease, political uncertainty, and nearly a quarter of a century away from home. They returned wealthy, experienced, carrying stories unlike anything most Europeans had ever heard. And yet homecoming after very long journeys rarely unfolds as neatly as people imagine. Because Marco has changed, and Venice has changed too. The city appears slowly from the water, rising through pale lagoon mist exactly as it once did during his childhood. Bell towers emerge above the canals. Fishing boats drift through narrow waterways. Market noise carries faintly across damp morning air. Everything should feel familiar, but familiarity itself has become fragile. Marco left Venice as a teenager. He returns as a middle-aged man, carrying decades of memories from worlds most Venetians cannot even picture clearly. The city suddenly feels smaller. Not lesser, simply smaller. The canals seem narrower after the enormous rivers and waterways of Asia. The markets feel crowded but provincial, compared to the endless movement of Kambalik. Even the political arguments of Venice now sound strangely local after years spent inside the orbit of continental empires. One cold evening, Marco walks through the Rialto district, listening to merchants argue loudly over shipping contracts, while fireplace smoke drifts into the winter air. The familiar sounds of Venice surround him once again, and yet part of him remains elsewhere. That feeling is difficult to describe. Travelers throughout history often experience it after returning home from distant places. The unsettling realization that the person who left no longer fully exists. Home remembers an earlier version of you, but you have continued changing. Marco carries entire landscapes inside his memory now. The Taklamakan Desert, the court of Kublai Khan, canals crowded with grain barges, coal fires burning through northern winters, paper money passing between merchants. How does one explain such things beside a Venetian dinner table? Very carefully, perhaps, or perhaps not carefully at all. Stories about Marco Polo spread quickly through Venice. Some listeners are fascinated, others politely doubtful. The problem is not merely that Marco describes distant places, it is that he describes them as richer, larger, and more sophisticated than many Europeans expect possible. That unsettles people. One merchant sits beside a crowded tavern fire, listening, while Marco describes black stones used for fuel in northern China. Around him, several listeners exchange uncertain glances. Coal somehow sounds more unbelievable than dragons. At least dragons have the courtesy to remain clearly mythical. But rocks that burn? Paper functioning as money? Cities larger than anything in Europe? The stories challenge ordinary assumptions too directly. And so Marco acquires a nickname, Marco Millions. The name carries multiple meanings at once. Some use it mockingly, implying that Marco exaggerates everything into impossible grandeur. Others use it more affectionately, amused by the sheer scale of his tales. Perhaps both interpretations are true. Venetians are merchants themselves. They understand storytelling as performance, almost as much as business. Exaggeration does not necessarily offend them, but they remain cautious. A man claiming to have crossed half the world and served the great Khan naturally attracts suspicion. One evening, several wealthy merchants gather for dinner inside a candlelit Venetian home, while rain taps softly against the shutters outside. Wine flows steadily. Fish stew cools slowly in heavy bowls. Marco speaks about the cities of the East, about the wealth of the Yuan Empire, about roads stretching across Asia beneath Mongol administration. The listeners remain polite, interested, skeptical. One older merchant smiles carefully, while asking whether these eastern cities truly contain populations larger than entire European regions combined. Marco insists they do. Silence settles briefly across the table. Then someone changes the subject toward shipping insurance. Human beings often retreat toward familiar topics when reality begins feeling too large. Still, Marco's stories continue spreading, because even doubtful listeners cannot entirely resist them. Europe during this period hungers for information about Asia. Trade routes matter deeply. Luxury goods from the East already shape economies across the Mediterranean. Merchants constantly search for advantages, opportunities, and new connections. And Marco offers something rare, not rumors passed through 5 intermediaries, direct testimony, or at least testimony that claims to be direct. That distinction matters enormously. Even skeptics listen, because Marco speaks with confidence about systems most Europeans barely understand. Roads, postal relays, currency, administration, trade networks. He describes Asia not merely as a land of marvels, but as a functioning world. And gradually, almost despite themselves, listeners begin imagining it. That may be Marco's greatest achievement, not proving every detail beyond doubt, but making distant civilizations feel imaginable, reachable, real. Yet Marco himself does not fully settle back into ordinary Venetian life. How could he? He has spent years moving across the largest empire on earth. Years inside multilingual courts and enormous cities where caravans arrived from every direction imaginable. Venice now feels both comforting and strangely enclosed. The world beyond Europe no longer exists for him as abstraction. He has seen it, touched it, crossed it, and whether people believe him or not, changes very little about those memories. Then history intervenes once again, because Venice remains Venice, wealthy, restless, competitive. War eventually breaks out between Venice and Genoa, its longtime maritime rival. Marco participates in the conflict and is captured during a naval battle. And suddenly, after deserts, courts, and oceans, Marco Polo finds himself somewhere unexpectedly quiet. A prison cell in Genoa, stone walls, candlelight, time to remember, time to speak. And beside him soon sits a writer named Rustichello da Pisa, listening carefully while one of the strangest travel stories in medieval history slowly begins turning into a book. The prison in Genoa is quieter than the roads of Asia, quieter than caravan camps, quieter than the markets of Venice, quieter even than the court of Kublai Khan with all its vast ceremonial movement. After decades spent crossing deserts, oceans, cities, and empires, Marco Polo suddenly finds himself confined within stone walls. History sometimes changes direction in places that appear completely unimportant at the time. A prison cell, a dim lantern, two men talking to pass the hours. Outside, Genoa and Venice continue competing for wealth and influence across the Mediterranean. Ships still arrive in crowded harbors. Merchants still argue over cargo and contracts. The world continues moving. But inside the prison, movement slows into memory. The air smells faintly of damp stone, smoke, old straw, and candle wax. Footsteps echo occasionally through narrow corridors, while distant voices drift between cells late at night. Marco is no longer traveling. He is remembering. And memory behaves strangely when given enough silence. At some point during his imprisonment, Marco meets Rustichello da Pisa, a writer already known for composing romance literature filled with knights, distant courts, and adventurous journeys. The pairing could not have been more unusual. A merchant shaped by practical observation, and a storyteller shaped by literary imagination. Together, they begin reconstructing the East. One evening, Rustichello sharpens a quill carefully beside flickering candlelight, while Marco sits nearby, describing roads that cross the mountains of Central Asia. The writer pauses occasionally, asking questions. Distances, cities, customs, strange technologies. Then the scratching of ink begins again. Slowly, a book starts taking shape. Not all at once. Not as a perfect historical document carefully organized for future scholars. More like conversation, turning gradually into narrative. And that distinction matters enormously, because the travels of Marco Polo is not simply a diary. It is memory filtered through storytelling. The world Marco describes inside the prison is already softened by time. Years have passed since portions of the journey itself. Certain details sharpen in recollection, while others blur. Some stories almost certainly come from first-hand observation. Others likely arrive through hearsay gathered across caravan roads and port cities. And Rustichello shapes everything into language medieval readers would find compelling. The result becomes something unusual, part merchant report, part travel memoir, part wonder literature, part medieval adventure story. This blending later frustrates historians, searching desperately for perfect factual precision. But to medieval audiences, the mixture feels natural. People in the 13th century do not separate storytelling categories as rigidly as modern readers often do. Truth and narrative move together. One candle burns low, while Marco describes the court of Kublai Khan. Rustichello listens with growing fascination. He has likely written fictional adventures before, but now an actual traveler sits before him, describing cities, roads, currencies, and empires larger than anything most Europeans have imagined. A professional storyteller suddenly realizes he may have found the greatest material of his life. The prison itself almost disappears during these moments. The cell grows larger through narration. Marco speaks of desert winds carrying strange sounds through darkness, of paper money stamped with imperial authority, of enormous hunting parks filled with falcons and horses, of canal systems crowded with grain barges. And as the stories unfold, Europe quietly begins changing, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, through words. The language of the text itself reflects this blending of worlds. Rather than formal scholarly Latin, the book emerges in a flowing mixture of French and Italian, familiar to broader medieval audiences. That choice matters. Latin belonged largely to scholars and clergy, but vernacular storytelling could travel farther. Merchants could hear it. Nobles could enjoy it. Travelers could repeat it aloud beside fires and dinner tables. The book becomes accessible, portable, alive. Of course, an embellishment enters the narrative as well. Large numbers grow larger. Certain scenes become smoother and more theatrical through retelling. Medieval audiences enjoy marvels, and Rustichello understands rhythm, pacing, and dramatic imagery. But underneath the literary shaping remains Marco's practical eye. Again and again, the text returns to roads, administration, trade, taxes, cities, transport systems, and the organization of empire. Even when descriptions drift toward exaggeration, the underlying world still feels structured, real. That realism gives the book unusual power. One tired guard passing through the prison corridor late at night hears fragments of conversation, drifting from Marco's cell. Strange eastern cities, burning black stones, wealth beyond imagination. The guard shakes his head slightly and continues walking. He cannot possibly know that the words being spoken inside this quiet prison will eventually spread across Europe for centuries. There is something almost poetic about that. One of the most influential books in medieval history, emerging not from a royal court or grand monastery, but from confinement, from stillness after movement. And perhaps that stillness is necessary, because only after the journey ends can Marco finally begin understanding what the journey meant. The farther the book spreads, later across Europe, the less important perfect factual certainty becomes. What matters is that readers encounter a larger world, a world connected by trade routes, empires, ports, roads, technologies, and civilizations beyond Europe's familiar horizon. The East no longer feels entirely unreachable after Marco Polo, not because every detail is believed, but because the possibility itself has entered the imagination. And once an idea enters the imagination, it becomes very difficult to contain. The candlelight flickers lower inside the Genoese prison. Rustichello continues writing. Marco continues remembering, and somewhere beyond the prison walls, the story is already beginning its second journey, the longer one, the journey carried not by caravans or ships, but by books. Once the prison conversations end, the story begins traveling on its own. Not quickly at first. Medieval books move slowly through the world. Each copy must be written by hand. Ink dries carefully upon parchment while scribes bend for hours beneath weak candlelight. Every page demands labor, patience, and concentration. And yet, despite the slowness, Marco Polo's book spreads. From Genoa to Venice, from merchant households to noble courts, from monasteries to libraries, from one pair of hands into another. One winter night, a scribe sits alone beside a narrow window, while wind presses softly against the shutters outside. His fingers are stained dark with ink. Candle smoke curls upward toward wooden ceiling beams, while he carefully copies Marco's descriptions of eastern cities onto fresh parchment. Occasionally he pauses, perhaps in disbelief, perhaps in wonder. Then he dips the pen again and continues. Every copy slightly changes the story. That is important to remember. There is no single perfect version of the travels drifting unchanged through history. Medieval manuscripts behave more like rivers than statues. Scribes shorten passages, clarify confusing words, remove repetitions, or accidentally create new ones through simple mistakes. Some copies become more dramatic, others more practical. Certain details disappear entirely. New phrases emerge. The book lives by changing, and because it changes, it survives. Marco's story reaches Europe during a moment when curiosity about Asia is already growing. Trade networks continue expanding. Luxury goods from the East remain deeply valuable. Merchants want information. Princes want wealth. Travelers want roots. Scholars want knowledge. And Marco offers all of them something irresistible. Not a mythical paradise entirely disconnected from reality, but a functioning world. Cities, roads, markets, governments, trade systems. The East in Marco's account feels tangible enough to imagine reaching. That subtle shift changes everything. Before Marco Polo, many Europeans picture Asia through fragments, biblical references, ancient legends, scattered merchant rumors, half-understood geography drifting through old maps. After Marco, the East begins acquiring texture. Readers imagine canals crowded with grain barges, imperial roads stretching across the continent, markets filled with silk and spices, great cities glowing with lantern light beside rivers and walls. The distant world becomes more detailed, and detailed places feel more real. One young merchant in Venice studies a copied manuscript beside the warmth of a small fireplace, while rain falls steadily outside. His finger traces uncertain routes across a hand-drawn map beside the text. Cathay, Zipangu, Persia. The names themselves feel like openings. He has never traveled farther than the Mediterranean, but now the East no longer feels like the edge of a dream. It feels reachable. That psychological transformation may be Marco Polo's greatest historical influence, not proving every story beyond doubt, not even geographical accuracy alone, but widening Europe's imagination. Once people begin imagining distant worlds clearly, they eventually begin trying to reach them. And books can travel where armies cannot. The manuscript copies move steadily across Europe throughout the late medieval world. Nobles read them for entertainment. Merchants study them for opportunity. Mapmakers incorporate portions into geography. Storytellers repeat fragments beside tavern fires. The line between information and imagination grows beautifully blurry. Sometimes readers focus upon the marvels, the wealth of the great Khan, the giant cities, the strange customs. Other readers notice something else entirely: systems, roads, trade possibilities, the movement of goods, the organization of empire. These practical descriptions quietly matter just as much as the wonders, because Europe is changing during these centuries, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. Trade expands, shipbuilding improves, navigation develops further, merchants become increasingly influential. And somewhere inside that changing Europe, Marco's book continues whispering the same possibility again and again. The world is larger than you think. One librarian carefully places a worn manuscript onto a shelf after finishing repairs along its binding. The parchment smells faintly of dust, leather, wax, and age. Corners have softened beneath generations of hands turning the pages. The book already feels old, and yet its ideas remain restless. This is another strange aspect of Marco Polo's legacy. Many readers doubt portions of the story even while remaining fascinated by it. Skepticism and obsession grow together. People argue over whether the cities could truly be so large, whether paper money could truly function, whether one ruler could truly govern territories so enormous. But even doubt spreads the story further. Debate keeps the book alive. Meanwhile, the manuscripts continue drifting across Europe like seeds carried by wind. A copy reaches France. Another reaches the Iberian Peninsula. Another passes through merchant circles in Italy. Each reader imagines Asia slightly differently after encountering the text. And gradually the mental edges of Europe begin stretching outward, not physically yet, but imaginatively. That imaginative expansion matters deeply in history, because human beings rarely travel toward places they cannot first picture in their minds. Marco Polo's book does not immediately launch the age of exploration by itself. History is never that simple. Economics, politics, technology, religion, ambition, and competition all shape the centuries ahead. But the book contributes something essential: a believable vision of the East. Not perfect, not entirely reliable, but vivid enough to inspire movement. And among the many readers who will eventually encounter Marco's descriptions, one in particular will study the pages with extraordinary attention. A sailor from Genoa, a man named Christopher Columbus. Long before he crosses the Atlantic Ocean, he will sit beneath lantern light, reading Marco Polo's vision of Asia and imagining routes across the sea toward the riches of the East. The story by then has traveled far beyond its author, farther even than Marco himself once rode across the Silk Roads. By the late 15th century, nearly 200 years have passed since Marco Polo sat inside a Genoese prison, describing the roads of Asia to Rustichello da Pisa. Empires have shifted, kings have died, trade routes have changed, and yet the book continues moving quietly through Europe. Copy after copy, generation after generation, its pages grow worn at the corners, bindings loosen, ink fades slightly beneath candle smoke and damp air. But the dream inside the manuscript survives. The East remains rich in Europe's imagination, and increasingly, Europe wants direct access to it. Spices alone help drive obsession. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. These goods travel enormous distances through complicated trade networks before finally reaching European markets at extremely high prices. Merchants dream of shorter routes. Rulers dream of wealth. Sailors dream of opportunity. And among those sailors sits a man studying Marco Polo's descriptions with unusual intensity: Christopher Columbus. One evening, Columbus leans over a copy of Marco Polo's book, while lantern light trembles gently inside a small cabin room. The sea outside remains dark and restless beyond the harbor walls. Beside the manuscript lie maps, crowded with uncertain coastlines and optimistic assumptions. Columbus reads carefully: Cathay, Zipangu, the Great Khan, cities of wealth in the east. The world Marco Polo described no longer feels mythical to him. It feels reachable. This is the crucial inheritance Marco leaves behind. Not certainty, possibility. By Columbus's lifetime, overland trade routes toward Asia have become more difficult and politically complicated in many regions. The old Mongol stability that once protected large stretches of Eurasian travel has weakened. Meanwhile, maritime technology in Europe continues improving steadily. Ships grow stronger. Navigation becomes more ambitious. Ocean travel, while still dangerous, begins expanding beyond earlier limits. And Columbus develops an extraordinary idea. If Asia lies east across the land routes, then perhaps it can also be reached by sailing west across the ocean. The logic sounds simple. The reality is considerably less precise. Columbus studies geography intensely, but like many people of his era, he underestimates the size of the earth and overestimates the eastern reach of Asia, described in part through Marco Polo's accounts. He believes the voyage westward to Asia will be far shorter than it truly is. That miscalculation changes history. One young cabin boy aboard a Spanish vessel lies awake, listening to sailors argue softly about maps late into the night. Outside, waves strike the hull with slow, rhythmic force, while lanterns swing gently overhead. Some sailors trust Columbus. Others quietly suspect everyone aboard may eventually drift into endless ocean and disappear forever, which, to be fair, is not an entirely unreasonable concern. Ocean travel in the 15th century remains deeply uncertain. Wood creaks constantly. Storms emerge suddenly. Navigation depends upon stars, compasses, dead reckoning, and human judgment, layered together imperfectly. And yet Columbus sails westward anyway, toward Marco Polo's Asia, or at least toward the Asia he imagines from reading Marco's descriptions. That distinction matters enormously, because the world inside Columbus's mind is shaped partly by books. He expects wealthy eastern kingdoms, trading cities, the edges of Cathay, perhaps even lands connected somehow to the Great Khan's world, described centuries earlier. Instead, he reaches the Caribbean, and one of history's strangest moments quietly unfolds. Columbus insists repeatedly that he has approached Asia, or islands near it. Even as evidence grows increasingly confusing, he continues interpreting unfamiliar lands through expectations shaped partly by Marco Polo and older geographical assumptions. Human beings often see what they expect to see, especially after crossing terrifying oceans. One sailor standing beneath hot Caribbean sunlight listens, while Columbus discusses proximity to Asia with absolute confidence. Nearby palm trees sway gently in warm wind, while tropical birds call from dense green forests, unlike anything described in European maps. The sailor looks around uncertainly. This does not feel particularly close to Cathay. Still, the voyages continue, and although Columbus never truly reaches the Asia Marco Polo described, his westward expeditions permanently reshape connections between continents. The irony is extraordinary. A Venetian merchant's stories about Asia help inspire a Genoese sailor to search for the East by sailing westward, and in the process Europe collides with entirely different worlds. History often moves like this, indirectly, unexpectedly. One dream leading accidentally into another. Marco Polo himself could never have predicted such consequences while describing canal systems and paper, money inside a prison cell centuries earlier. Yet his book helped expand Europe's geographical imagination, enough to encourage movement beyond familiar boundaries. That influence matters profoundly, not because Marco created exploration alone, but because he contributed to a growing European belief that the wider world could be crossed, mapped, traded with, and reached. Stories change behavior, sometimes across centuries. Meanwhile, copies of Marco's book continue circulating through Europe even as new voyages reshape old maps. Readers compare recent discoveries against older descriptions of Asia. Cartographers redraw coastlines repeatedly. Merchants calculate new opportunities. The world grows larger and more connected in Europe's imagination, year by year. And through all these transformations, Marco Polo remains oddly present, not as conqueror, not as king, but as storyteller, a witness whose uncertain memories traveled farther than he ever could. By now, the story no longer belongs entirely to him. It has escaped into the currents of history itself, and long after Marco Polo's death, people will continue arguing softly, beneath library lamps and candlelight, about where he truly went, what he truly saw, and why his words changed the world anyway. By the end of his life, Marco Polo has become an old man in Venice. The roads are behind him now. No more deserts, no more mountain passes, no more monsoon seas or imperial courts filled with translators and messengers. The movement that once defined his life gradually slows into routine. Canal water laps softly against stone foundations outside Venetian windows. Church bells continue ringing across the lagoon, as they always have. Merchants still bargain in crowded markets. Fishermen still rise before dawn. The world moves on, and yet Marco's story keeps traveling. That is the strange thing about stories. They ignore many of the limits that restrain ordinary human lives. A caravan eventually stops. A ship eventually sinks. An empire eventually weakens. But a book can continue moving quietly through centuries long after its author disappears. One elderly Venetian reader sits beside candlelight, turning the brittle pages of a worn manuscript copy of the Travels. Outside, evening fog drifts slowly across the canals, while distant bells echo through damp winter air. The old man pauses occasionally beside certain passages. Cities beyond imagination, roads crossing Asia, paper money, the great Khan. Perhaps he believes every word, perhaps only part of it. It no longer matters entirely. The story itself has already changed Europe. Marco Polo dies sometime in the early 14th century. According to later tradition, friends gathered near his deathbed supposedly encouraged him to admit that portions of his stories had been exaggerated. The famous reply attributed to Marco is simple: "I did not tell half of what I saw." Whether he truly spoke those exact words remains uncertain. Medieval history collects dramatic final quotations, the way old harbors collect fog. Still, the line survives because it feels emotionally true, not necessarily factually perfect. Emotionally true, because no written account could fully contain the scale of Marco's experience anyway. How could language adequately capture 24 years crossing civilizations? The smell of caravan smoke in freezing mountain air, the endless noise of Asian market cities, the strange quiet of deserts beneath stars. The feeling of realizing Europe was only one corner of a much larger world. Some experiences resist compression into text, and yet Marco tried. That attempt became enough to alter history. Over the centuries, scholars continue debating the accuracy of his journey. Historians compare manuscripts. Archaeologists examine trade networks. Experts argue about omitted details, translation errors, exaggerations, and political context. The debates never fully end, and perhaps they never should, because uncertainty itself forms part of Marco Polo's legacy. He exists in the borderlands between memory and myth, observation and performance, witness and storyteller. But here is the important thing: even an imperfect book can reshape civilization. Marco's descriptions encouraged Europeans to imagine Asia differently, not merely as a distant land of fantasy, but as a place of cities, governments, technologies, roads, and wealth beyond familiar experience. That shift in imagination mattered profoundly. The East became imaginable, and imagined places eventually draw travelers toward them. One historian, working late inside a modern archive, carefully unfolds a fragile medieval manuscript beneath soft electric light. Dust drifts silently through the room. Around her stand shelves containing centuries of human memory, pressed into paper and leather. She studies the text quietly. 700 years later, Marco Polo still refuses to disappear completely. That endurance says something important about human beings. Facts matter deeply. Accuracy matters. But stories also shape civilizations through emotion, possibility, and imagination. Marco Polo helped widen Europe's sense of the world, not because every sentence he wrote was unquestionably correct, but because he made distant places feel vivid enough to matter. And once the imagination expands, history often follows behind it. The centuries after Marco bring enormous change. Maritime empires rise. Trade routes shift toward the oceans. European ships circle Africa, cross the Atlantic, and eventually reach Asia directly by sea. Cultures collide more intensely than ever before. Commerce, conflict, migration, disease, religion, and technology all move across widening global networks. The world grows increasingly connected, not always peacefully, not always wisely, but continuously. And somewhere near the beginning of that expanding awareness sits a Venetian merchant, describing roads across Asia to a prison cell companioned by candlelight. There is something quietly humbling about that. History does not always change through kings and battles alone. Sometimes it changes through conversations, through books copied by tired scribes, through travelers trying imperfectly to describe what they witnessed. Marco Polo's greatest influence may not have been geographical at all. It may have been psychological. He helped persuade Europe that the wider world could be crossed, that distant civilizations were real, that unfamiliar peoples possessed systems, knowledge, wealth, and histories worthy of attention. For medieval Europe, that realization mattered enormously. One final evening settles softly across Venice. Water moves gently through the canals beneath fading lantern light. A gondolier guides his boat through narrow passages while somewhere nearby, a window closes against the cold night air. The city remains much as it always was, restless, maritime, balanced between worlds. Perhaps that is why Marco Polo could only have come from Venice, a place built upon movement, a city where stories arrived daily beside cargo ships and returning sailors, a city already facing eastward long before Marco ever departed. And now, centuries later, his own story continues drifting outward across time, much like those old merchant vessels crossing dark water toward distant horizons, not perfectly preserved, not perfectly certain, but enduring. Because human beings have always needed stories that make the world feel larger and quieter now. As the night deepens around the old Venetian canals, Marco Polo's journey finally slows into stillness. The roads fade softly into memory. The lanterns dim, the pages close, and somewhere beyond the last harbor lights, the past keeps watch a little while longer. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's wandering. Whether your eyes are still open or already drifting, thank you for keeping me company here among worn stones, warm embers, and the small brave rituals of ordinary people. If this brought you a little quiet, you're welcome to subscribe or share it with someone who might need a softer night. For now, rest well. You're safe, you're warm, and the past can keep watch.